In this lesson, we'll learn about some of the ways that we can use Mudbox with Photoshop in creating our textures. Now obviously, Mudbox provides a great deal in terms of texture creation within the program, but there may be times when we'd like to use a 2D image editing package like Photoshop to modify our texture maps. Now there are a number of ways that we can take advantage of the close integration with Photoshop that Mudbox provides, so let's take a look at a few of those. So here we have our textured T-Rex project that we're working on. And if we look over here, we can see that we have a number of paint layers associated with this across a number of different channels. Here's our diffuse color channel with 3 different paint layers associated with that being blended together. So if we want to take any of these paint layers out as texture maps to be able to edit in something like Photoshop, there are a couple of things that we can do. The first thing would be to export each individual paint layer. So I could right click on each layer, say export selected, or we could go right up here and do the same thing. Okay, we can also import that layer back in, or we can import new texture layers as paint layers, or new texture maps rather as paint layers. Okay, so one workflow would be to kind of export that out, do some changes, re-import that back in, but that takes a little bit of time. There are a few more steps involved than what we'd like. So Mudbox actually provides a really close integration with Photoshop that can really make things work, make things go a little bit faster for us. So let's take a look at how we can do that. So what we'll do is we've got something, one of the paint layers selected on our diffuse channel. I'm going to go ahead and go right up here to export channel to PSD. And now this is assuming, of course, that you have Photoshop installed on your machine. So we'll go ahead and click that. It's going to bring up an option for saving this out. So export paint channel to PSD. It's going to ask us for a name of our file. So we'll call this something meaningful. Dino skin, something like that. So we'll go ahead and save this file. And so as this saves, it's going to automatically open this up in Photoshop. So let's just give this a second. Okay, so once it's saved that out, it brings up this window in Mudbox, and it's an indicator that's telling us it's watching that file. So it's created that connection between Mudbox and Photoshop with that file as sort of the in-between. So it's telling us we can now edit our image file. We've got the option to close this, or we have a button over here that's currently grayed out. This will allow us to re-import that skin. Now it knows that no changes have been saved out to that yet, so that's why this is grayed out. So let's jump over into Photoshop and make a few adjustments to our texture. So this is the file that comes in automatically into Photoshop. And so let's take a look at some of the elements of this. We've got the diffuse background, which is kind of that color, the base material color in the back. We've got that initial base texture that we painted, so that base layer. These are associated with those 3 paint layers that we saw. So we've got the body color, the spots, which you can see those turn off and on, and the spots large and the spots, and the opacity is come in as well on those. All right. So, and we also have a UV reference layer on top of this that we can come in and use for our texturing. So if we kind of move in on this, you can see that gives us an indication of where those UVs are. So it creates a really nice clean layout for us to start working. So if we want to, we can come in and go just to the base layer, and let's kind of look at the claws here. And so, well, maybe we see, well, there's some kind of white artifacts there that we don't really want. So what we can do is we'll just sample that color, and I'll just paint that out. Of course, anything beyond the UV boundaries here are not going to show up on our model, so we don't need to worry too much about that. So I'll just kind of paint that in to get rid of some of that white artifacting. While we're here, we can also kind of paint in some detail if we want to. Grab maybe the, let's grab the burn. And then come in and just kind of paint in some sort of striations, maybe along some of the claws. Okay, so any sort of detail that you want to add using this sort of more traditional painting method, you can here in Photoshop. So tweak up your base layer here, add any sort of color detail on any of the painting and so forth on our texture maps here. Okay, just as you would with your normal Photoshop workflow as far as getting that texture map out, having the UV map on top of it as reference, all of that is here. All right, so let's say we just want to do a little bit of work there on those claws. Let's also say that maybe we want to add some extra spots along the tail. So beyond just painting on our color, we can also add additional layers. So we'll go ahead and add a new layer, and we can call this tail spots. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and sample color from kind of the underneath of the body here, and let's make this a bit darker. And I'll just get the paintbrush, and let's just start to add some spots underneath the tail. And you don't have to be spots, you can add any sort of detail that you want. Just create a new layer in order to do that. So I'll just add a few of these spots in here. Let's go over and do the same thing here on the other side. Okay, maybe some of these are a little bit bigger. Clump them together a little bit. Alright, just a little bit of detail here as a new layer. Alright, so once we've got the changes made to whatever texture it is that we're working on, all we need to do now is save this file in Photoshop. So go ahead and save. Okay, and now let's close Photoshop. I'll minimize it and open up Mudbox and see what's happened. So this button has now become active because it knows that some changes have been saved to that channel, so that image file. So we'll go ahead and say re-import dinoskin.psd, and that will bring in that modified texture into our Mudbox scene. Alright, so we can go ahead and now close this out. You can see that we have a new layer here, which I'll just drag up to the top of the stack there. Right there. Okay, so let's now go ahead and kind of take a look at this. Alright. So we can kind of see a little bit of that burn that we did on the claws. We can see the spots underneath that we've added here. The great thing about this is we can now go in and modify the opacity because that's a different layer, okay, rather than being on the base color. Alright, so, and again, if you want to keep working on this, you could export this back out, or you could keep that connection. Another thing, if you want to do, if you want to just export this out, if you're not going to be working back and forth closely with Photoshop and Mudbox at the same time, but you do want to be able to re-import that, you can also export that out, and then when you're ready, just re-import that. So you don't have to use that dialog there to actually re-import immediately. You could go ahead and import that later from the PSD that you save out. So it doesn't have to be an immediate workflow. It could be something where you take that out into Photoshop, do some work for a couple of hours, couple of days, and then bring this back into Mudbox as well. So that's another way to work also. All right, so another thing that we can do is to actually use a 3D view and paint on that view in Photoshop. So let's say that we want to add some detail maybe to the arm here. So I'm just going to get the camera in position. I'm going to select the body color here. And for this, we're going to go over to File, and let's go to Export Screen to PSD. You can see the hotkey combination for that is Alt-E. Alright, this is going to give us the option to change the size, so we can use the screen size, we can use double the screen size, 4 times the screen size, and also we have the ability to constrain proportions. Alright, so we'll go ahead and choose the size, and we'll just leave that as is, and we'll go Export to PSD. Alright, that'll give us the ability to again save out a PSD file. So this time we'll call this something like a dino arm, and I'll go ahead and save that. Alright, so it brings up a very similar box that we saw before. It says you can now edit that file, and we have the same sort of buttons. We have close and re-import. Let's go ahead and close this out. We'll go over and look at what Photoshop looks like here. So here we have a view of our model, basically a kind of a screen capture of that angle of the camera with the shading and everything on it. And if we go ahead and look at our layers, they're going to be a little bit different than the ones we saw earlier. You can see we have a background, and that actually has information about the camera, so we don't want to change any of the naming of these layers, anything like that, okay? And it actually says on some of these, do not modify. Here we have the underneath texture here, and then we have the shading on top of that, so there's our flat texture and the shading over this. So really, the layer that we want to modify is this layer here, the Mudbox texture. It actually says paint here, so it's pretty straightforward. So what we can do is to go ahead and modify this. We can, if we want to, add a little bit of paint here, maybe we want to dodge some of these areas. Go ahead and dial this down a little bit. Maybe we want to kind of brighten up some of these spots from this angle. Maybe we have a shot from a particular angle and it really needs to look good from that angle, we can do that here just by using the camera. Okay, so we could come in and kind of brighten up some of those areas from this angle. If we also wanted to create a new layer, we could do that. Come in here and let's kind of paint in some sort of skin detail here. Okay. Maybe something like that. Okay, and then we could go ahead and dial the opacity of that down. Okay. And let's maybe do a soft light, take that opacity down a little bit. So whatever kind of design you want, maybe you could go in and kind of sharpen that up a little bit. Sharpen those ends up. Now we want to go ahead and merge this down so that it becomes part of this Mudbox texture. So I'm going to turn everything off. Okay, and then let's go ahead and merge visible. Okay, so we have all those changes and we have that on the existing Mudbox texture. So let's go ahead and save this. So we've saved the file, and now let's jump back over into Mudbox. All right, so let's say that we don't have that dialog up anymore. So what we want to do is just go back and re-import from PSD. Okay, so that'll bring up the option to choose the file that we just used. And so let's go ahead and say open up. Okay, so what that's going to do is bring that file in and project that texture onto our model. And it's going to give us an indication that it's in fact done that. You can see it's actually loaded that up as a stencil. You can see that stencil here, and it's actually updated that image file with the markings. All right, so that's also a good way to make changes. If you have to make changes based on a specific camera angle, you can do that as well, and that's going to be found over here under File, Export Screen to PSD, Re-import from PSD. So again, here in Mudbox, there are a number of different ways that we can really use Mudbox in conjunction with Photoshop very closely to really take advantage of what each software package has to offer in terms of texture creation and really work quickly back and forth between the two. Okay, so we've looked at integration with Photoshop, and I think the next thing that we want to look at is map extraction here in Mudbox. So getting all of our high-res detail out as the different kinds of maps that we're able to create here in Mudbox. So we'll look at that in the next lesson.